Arthur, it was work. Don't turn this into something it isn't.
What a magnificent bracelet, Chloe. Someone must value you very highly.
My husband straightened his tailored Tom Ford tie, looked me dead in the eye, and whispered, "Tonight, just smile, nod, and for God's sake, keep your mouth shut." He thought I was just his naive little wife. He didn't know I was already holding the microphone. For the last 3 years, my marriage to Connor had been slowly morphing into a silent, velvet-lined cage. To the outside world, we were the picture-perfect couple living in a sprawling, modern townhouse in the affluent suburbs of Chicago. Connor was the rising star at Meridian Logistics, a massive supply chain management firm, and I was his devoted, supportive wife. What the outside world didn't know was that I used to be a senior financial analyst. I was the one who practically tutored Connor through his MBA. I stepped away from my career not because I wanted to bake sourdough and arrange hydrangeas, but because Connor's mother, Beatrice, was diagnosed with early-onset Alzheimer's. We couldn't afford the round-the-clock care she needed at the time, and Connor's career was just taking off. "It makes sense for us, Nora," he had pleaded, holding my hands in our cramped apartment kitchen. "Just for a few years. When I make partner, you can go back, I promise." I kept that promise. I cared for Beatrice until she passed away last year, but by then, Connor had rewritten our history. With his 6-figure bonuses and shiny new vice president title, his ego had inflated to the point where it consumed all the oxygen in our home. He no longer saw me as his equal. To him, I was a domestic accessory, someone to keep his shirts pressed, his meals prepped, and his image polished. He started explaining simple concepts to me, using a slow, patronizing tone as if my brain had atrophied from too much daytime television. The night of the Meridian Logistics Annual Executive Gala was a masterclass in his condescension. I stood in front of our bedroom mirror, adjusting the delicate clasp of my pearl necklace. I was wearing a floor-length emerald green gown that I had bought specifically for this occasion. It was elegant, understated, and frankly, I felt beautiful. Connor walked into the room, smelling heavily of Tom Ford cologne and peppermint breath mints. He didn't even look at me as he walked past to retrieve his cufflinks from the mahogany dresser. "Connor, what do you think?" I asked, turning slightly so he could see the dress. He paused, gave me a cursory half-second glance, and sighed. "It's fine, Nora, but listen to me. Tonight is critical. Theodore Brooks is flying in from the New York office." Theodore Brooks was the CEO of Meridian Logistics. He was an industry titan, known for being ruthlessly observant and having zero tolerance for incompetence. "I know who Mr. Brooks is, Connor," I said, my voice steady despite the familiar knot tightening in my stomach. "Good. Then you know I am in the running for the senior VP spot," Connor said, finally turning to face me. He stepped into my personal space, his eyes cold and assessing. "This means you need to be on your best behavior. No rambling about your book club. No complaining about the kitchen renovation. And please, don't try to chime in on the business conversations. The executives don't want to hear a housewife's take on global shipping logistics." The sheer audacity of his words felt like a slap. "A housewife's take?" I echoed, my voice dangerously low. "Connor, 3 months ago you were hyperventilating on the floor of your home office because your quarterly projections were off by $3 million. I was the one who found the error in your pivot tables and rewrote your entire financial summary for the board." His jaw clenched. "That was just data entry, Nora. Don't flatter yourself. The strategy was all mine. And tonight, you are going to let me shine. Just smile, nod, and for God's sake, keep your mouth shut. If you embarrass me in front of Theodore, I will never forgive you." He didn't wait for my response. He turned and walked out of the room, leaving me staring at my reflection. My hands were trembling, not from sadness, but from a deep, volcanic rage that had been brewing for months. I looked at the woman in the mirror. She was 32, brilliant, and completely undervalued. I took a deep breath, smoothing the fabric of my dress. "Okay, Connor," I whispered to the empty room. "I'll keep my mouth shut, but I can't promise everyone else will." The car ride to the Drake Hotel was agonizingly silent. Connor spent the entire 45 minutes frantically texting on his phone, occasionally muttering under his breath. He didn't offer me a single compliment, nor did he ask how I was doing. I sat in the dim light of the back seat, watching the city lights blur past the rain-streaked window, plotting absolutely nothing yet. At that point, I just wanted to survive the night and perhaps, the next morning, finally contact a divorce attorney. I had no idea that Connor was about to hand me the ultimate weapon to destroy him. The grand ballroom at the Drake was a spectacle of corporate excess. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm, golden glow over the sea of black-tie attendees. Waiters glided through the crowd carrying silver trays of champagne and caviar blinis. A string quartet played a modern pop song disguised as classical music in the corner. The moment we stepped through the double mahogany doors, Connor's entire demeanor shifted. The cold, irritable husband vanished, replaced by the charming, charismatic executive. He grabbed a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, handed it to me without looking, and immediately began scanning the room like a hawk looking for prey. "There's Thomas," Connor muttered. "And Gemma." Gemma Hayes was the director of operations. She was a striking woman with razor-sharp blonde bobs, clad in a sleek black dress that hugged her curves tightly. I had met her a few times at previous company barbecues. She was always perfectly polite to me, but in that saccharine, dismissive way women use when they consider you entirely irrelevant. Connor practically dragged me over to their circle. "Connor, you made it!" Gemma said, her eyes lighting up. She leaned in to kiss his cheek, lingering perhaps a second too long. "And Nora, how sweet of you to come." "Hi, Gemma Thomas," I said, offering a polite smile. Thomas, a nervous-looking man in the IT department, nodded at me. "Nice to see you, Nora." "Connor, we were just talking about the Zenith project," Gemma said, turning her back slightly toward me, effectively boxing me out of the circle. "Theodore is already asking about the third quarter margins. You have the updated files, right?" "Of course I do," Connor said smoothly, puffing out his chest. "I ran the numbers myself this morning. We are projecting a 14% increase in efficiency. Theodore is going to be blown away." I took a sip of my champagne to hide my scoff. The Zenith project was Connor's golden goose. It was a complete restructuring of their Midwest freight routes, but Connor hadn't run those numbers this morning. I knew this for a fact, because I had seen the open Excel spreadsheets on his laptop yesterday when he asked me to print them. The formulas were a mess. I had spent 2 hours fixing the macros and correcting the tax depreciation values so he wouldn't look like an absolute fool. He had literally stolen my work again and was now bragging about it to the very woman he was trying to impress. "Well, you are the genius of the hour," Gemma purred, lightly touching Connor's forearm. "I don't know how you manage to juggle all this high-level strategy." "It takes dedication," Connor said, glancing at me briefly. "Some of us are just wired for the grind. Others prefer a softer life." The insult was barely veiled. Thomas awkwardly cleared his throat and looked at his shoes. Before I could say a word, a ripple of hushed energy moved through the crowd. Theodore Brooks had arrived. Theodore was a tall, imposing man in his late 60s. He had thick silver hair and wore a bespoke tuxedo that probably cost more than my first car. He commanded the room without saying a word. Immediately, the executives flocked toward him like moths to a flame. "Stay here," Connor hissed in my ear. "Don't follow me. I need one-on-one time with him." Connor darted off, leaving me standing alone near a massive ice sculpture of the company logo. I watched as he elbowed his way into Theodore's orbit, laughing too loud at a joke Theodore made. I felt a sudden, crushing wave of humiliation. I was a prop he had brought and then discarded in the corner. I decided I wasn't going to stand there and play the pathetic wife. I turned and made my way toward the quieter side of the ballroom, aiming for the long, sweeping balcony that overlooked the city. As I pushed past the heavy velvet curtains, the cool night air hit my face, offering a brief respite from the suffocating atmosphere inside. The balcony was mostly empty, save for a few smokers at the far end. I leaned against the stone balustrade, taking deep breaths, trying to calm the anger that was now making my hands shake. "Beautiful night, isn't it?" I jumped, startled. I turned to my right. Standing in the shadows, nursing a tumbler of scotch, was Theodore Brooks. My heart did a painful stutter step. Connor's boss, the man I was expressly forbidden to speak to. "Oh, Mr. Brooks. I'm sorry, I didn't see you there," I said, instinctively falling back on my polite, deferential programming. Theodore stepped into the light. He had sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to take in every detail of my appearance in a fraction of a second. "Please, it's Theodore." "And you are?" "Nora," I said, extending my hand. "Nora." I hesitated for a fraction of a second. Connor's wife. He took my hand, his grip firm. Ah, Connor's wife. The man of the hour. Theodore took a slow sip of his scotch. He's certainly very enthusiastic tonight. He's been looking forward to this evening, I said carefully, remembering Connor's warning. Keep your mouth shut. He tells me he practically rewrote the book on the Midwest freight routes, Theodore said, leaning against the balustrade next to me. The Zenith Project. It's a very impressive piece of work, highly analytical, a bit out of character for him, honestly. Connor has always been more of a salesman than a numbers guy. I froze. Theodore Brooks didn't become a billionaire CEO by being oblivious. He was fishing. He smelled something off about Connor's sudden stroke of genius. I looked at Theodore. I thought about the years I had sacrificed. I thought about the condescension in Connor's voice, the dismissive wave of his hand, the way he looked at Gemma. Just smile, nod, and for God's sake, keep your mouth shut. A terrifying, thrilling spark ignited in my chest. Well, Theodore, I said, keeping my voice perfectly even. Connor is excellent at presenting data. But the core strategy of the Zenith Project, specifically the restructuring of the tax depreciation models to offset the fuel surcharges in the third quarter, requires a background in forensic accounting. Theodore stopped with his glass halfway to his mouth. He turned his head slowly, locking his piercing eyes onto mine. Forensic accounting? That's exactly the methodology used in the proposal. Connor told me he came up with that over a weekend. Did he? I smiled softly, looking out at the city skyline. That's fascinating, because I was a senior financial auditor for Deloitte for 6 years before I stepped away to care for my late mother-in-law. And I spent 3 days last week rebuilding those exact Excel macros on our home computer. Silence stretched between us. The sounds of the string quartet inside seemed very far away. Theodore didn't laugh. He didn't look shocked. Instead, a slow, predatory smile spread across his face. Is that so, Nora? It is, I said, turning to face him fully. I can recite the exact formulas to you right now if you'd like. I can also tell you that Connor's original projections ignored the new interstate tariff laws, which would have cost Meridian Logistics roughly $4 million in fines. Theodore stared at me for a long time. You're not just a supportive wife, are you, Nora? I am incredibly supportive, Theodore, I replied smoothly. I just prefer my support to be factually accurate. Theodore chuckled, a deep rumbling sound. Well, this changes things. I was wondering how a man who couldn't balance a basic departmental budget 2 years ago suddenly produced a masterclass in supply chain economics. He finished his scotch and set the glass on the stone rail. Walk with me, Nora. I have a feeling there are a few more things you and I should discuss. Theodore offered me his arm, and together we walked off the balcony, bypassing the crowded main floor of the ballroom. We headed toward the quiet corridor that housed the VIP lounges and executive coat rooms. Tell me, Theodore asked in a low voice as we walked, if you are the brains behind Zenith, why did you let him present it as his own? Because I loved him, I answered honestly, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. Because he promised me that once he made senior VP, our lives would settle down. But things have changed. He's gotten arrogant, Theodore observed astutely. He thinks I'm stupid, I corrected him. And I have a very low tolerance for being treated like a fool. As we approached the end of the corridor, the main event coordinator, a frantic woman with a clipboard, rushed past us. The speeches are in 10 minutes. Mr. Brooks, we need you in the green room, she called over her shoulder. I'll be right there, Theodore called back, unflappable. He turned to me. I have to give the opening remarks. Then, I am supposed to call Connor up to the stage to officially announce his promotion to senior vice president. My stomach dropped. You're promoting him tonight? Theodore's eyes glinted. I was going to, based on the Zenith Project. But now, I think I need to have a very serious conversation with your husband. Before I could reply, a sound caught my attention. It was a hushed, sharp giggle coming from one of the small, private meeting rooms down the hall. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of yellow light spilling onto the patterned carpet. I recognized that giggle. It was Gemma. I held up a hand, stopping Theodore in his tracks. He raised a silver eyebrow in question, but I just pressed my finger to my lips. We walked silently toward the cracked door. Connor, stop! Gemma's voice drifted out, breathless and amused. Someone is going to see us. Let them, Connor's voice replied, thick with arrogance. I practically own this place tonight. After Theodore calls me up on that stage, I'm untouchable. Theodore stiffened beside me. I could see the muscles in his jaw ticking. Are you sure the old man is going to retire next year? Gemma asked. Positive, Connor scoffed. Brooks is losing his touch. He didn't even question the padding in the budget for the new warehouse acquisitions. Once I'm senior VP, I'll have direct control over the vendor contracts. And the shell accounts? Gemma asked, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. I felt all the blood drain from my face. Shell accounts? I thought Connor was just an egomaniacal plagiarist. I had no idea he was crossing into federal crimes. Already set up, Connor said smugly. My buddy at Apex Financial drafted the LLCs. We funnel the inflated vendor invoices through the dummy corp, skim the top 10%, and Meridian Logistics writes it off as operational friction. It's foolproof. We'll be pulling an extra $1 million a year, tax-free. You'll get your cut, just like I promised. You are so brilliant, Gemma practically purred. I know, Connor laughed. The best part? If the IRS ever gets suspicious, I've got the perfect fall guy. Who? Nora. I stopped breathing. Beside me, Theodore Brooks was absolutely still, radiating a terrifying, icy fury. Your wife? Gemma asked, sounding surprised. Isn't she kind of simple? You said she just stays home and cleans. She is simple, Connor sneered. But she used to be an auditor. I've been having her log into my home computer to check my math on the Zenith project. Her IP address and digital signature are all over the corrupted spreadsheets that tie to the vendor accounts. If anyone ever audits the trail, it looks like my bored, ex-accountant wife tried to run a side hustle embezzlement scheme without my knowledge. I play the betrayed husband. She goes to federal prison, and I keep the cash. A sickening wave of nausea washed over me. He wasn't just gaslighting me. He wasn't just cheating on me. He was actively framing me for corporate fraud so he could steal millions from his company. He was planning to destroy my life, my freedom, and my future, all while I was washing his laundry and ironing his shirts. I looked at Theodore. His face was a mask of cold, unadulterated rage. He reached into his tuxedo jacket, pulling out his phone to hit record, but I stopped him. I didn't want a quiet firing. I didn't want Connor to be pulled into a back room and quietly handed over to the police. I wanted to fulfill his request. I wanted to let him shine. I noticed a small, black rolling cart left by the AV team near the wall. On it sat a wireless lapel microphone, the green light blinking, indicating it was live and synced to the main ballroom system. The event coordinator must have left it there for Connor to put on before his speech. I grabbed Theodore's sleeve, pulling him back from the door. I pointed at the microphone, then pointed at the ballroom doors down the hall. Theodore looked at the mic, then at the cracked door, and finally, at me. A slow, dark understanding passed between us. The CEO of Meridian Logistics gave me a single, crisp nod. I picked up the microphone. It was surprisingly heavy. I turned the gain dial on the side all the way up. My hands weren't shaking anymore. They were perfectly, deadly, still. I crept silently to the cracked door. Inside, Connor was kissing her neck. We just have to suffer through the rest of this stupid gala, he murmured. Then I ditch Nora, and we celebrate in my suite. I carefully slid the live microphone onto the small decorative table, just an inch inside the room, right behind the door hinge. It was perfectly concealed by a potted fern, completely invisible to the two of them, but intimately close to their voices. I stepped back, joining Theodore in the hallway. Mr. Brooks, Thomas, the nervous IT guy, came jogging around the corner, looking panicked. We need you in the ballroom right now. The master of ceremonies just announced your speech. The house speakers are on. Perfect timing, Thomas, Theodore said smoothly, adjusting his cuffs. Let's go. As we walked back down the hallway, the booming voice of the MC echoed through the massive double doors of the ballroom. And now, to say a few words and make a very special announcement, please welcome the CEO of Meridian Logistics, Mr. Theodore Brooks. The crowd erupted into polite, roaring applause. Theodore opened the doors and we stepped into the cavernous room. The applause began to die down as Theodore walked toward the stage. But then, an echoing, magnified sound cut through the ballroom. It wasn't feedback. It was the sound of heavy breathing, broadcast over 30 state-of-the-art surround sound speakers. The room fell dead, silent. "Oh God, Connor," Gemma's voice moaned, vibrating through the crystal chandeliers. "You're so bad." A collective gasp sucked the air out of the ballroom. 500 executives, board members, and their spouses froze in horror. "I told you," Connor's smug, unmistakable voice boomed from the speakers, echoing off the gold leaf ceiling. "I'm going to own this company. Theodore is a dinosaur. The old man has no idea I've been skimming off the Midwest accounts for 6 months." The silence in the room was absolute. You could hear a pin drop. Every single eye darted around, trying to find the source of the audio. Theodore stopped walking. He stood in the dead center of the ballroom floor, his hands folded neatly behind his back, staring blankly at the stage. "And Nora won't suspect a thing?" Gemma's voice projected loudly. "Nora?" Connor laughed cruelly, the sound bouncing off the walls. "My wife is an idiot. She's too busy folding my socks to realize she's the prime suspect for a federal embezzlement charge. Now zip my pants up. I have to go accept my promotion." I stood near the ice sculpture, sipping my champagne. I took Connor's advice. I didn't say a single word. I just smiled. The silence in the grand ballroom was heavier than lead. It was a suffocating, physical weight that pressed down on the 500 people frozen in their black tie attire. No one moved. No one spoke. The only sound was the faint clinking of a dropped oyster fork against a porcelain plate, echoing like a gunshot. The audio had cut off abruptly, likely because someone in the AV booth had violently pulled the main power cord in a state of sheer panic. But the damage was done. The words had been carved into the very architecture of the room. Then, the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the hall swung open. Connor strode in, adjusting the lapels of his Tom Ford tuxedo. He walked with the swagger of a newly crowned king. 2 steps behind him was Gemma, her blonde bob slightly disheveled, her lipstick freshly reapplied. They were smiling. They were entirely, blissfully oblivious. They expected the room to be filled with the dull roar of corporate chatter, perhaps transitioning into polite applause for Theodore's upcoming speech. Instead, they walked into a mausoleum. Connor paused, his brow furrowing as he took in the sea of faces staring directly at him. He didn't see admiration. He saw shock, disgust, and in the case of the senior board members seated near the front, unbridled, homicidal fury. "What's going on?" Connor whispered loudly to Gemma, who had suddenly stopped dead in her tracks, her face draining of all color as she felt the collective glare of her colleagues. At the front of the room, Theodore Brooks finally moved. He didn't rush. He didn't shout. He took slow, deliberate steps up the carpeted stairs to the main stage. He tapped the microphone on the podium. It hummed back to life, the feedback mercifully suppressed by the terrified sound engineers. "Ladies and gentlemen," Theodore's voice resonated, smooth and deadly calm. "I believe there has been a slight change in tonight's programming." Connor's chest puffed out slightly. He still thought this was about him. He thought the silence was an awestruck precursor to his grand introduction. I watched him from my spot by the ice sculpture, taking another slow sip of champagne. "Connor," Theodore said, his eyes locking onto my husband across the vast expanse of the ballroom. "Please, come up to the stage." Connor beamed. He actually beamed. He turned to Gemma, gave her a triumphant wink that made several people in the front row physically recoil, and began his long walk to the front. The crowd parted for him like the Red Sea, not out of respect, but out of a desperate desire to avoid being associated with a walking corpse. He jogged up the stairs, extending his hand toward Theodore. "Theodore, thank you. This is such an honor." Theodore looked at Connor's outstretched hand as if it were covered in a highly infectious disease. He did not take it. He simply leaned into the microphone. "Connor," Theodore said softly, though the speakers projected it to every corner of the room. "Tell me about the Zenith Project." Connor chuckled, looking out at the silent, glaring audience, clearly confused by the lack of applause. "Well, Theodore, as you know, it's a comprehensive restructuring of our Midwest freight routes. I spent months analyzing the tax depreciation models to offset forensic accounting, wasn't it?" Theodore interrupted, his voice dropping an octave. Connor blinked. "Excuse me?" "The methodology," Theodore pressed, his gaze piercing through Connor. "You used forensic accounting principles, Impressive for a man who failed his corporate finance module twice in training. Did you do it all by yourself, Connor? Or did you have, let's say, a bored ex-accountant wife? Check your math? Connor's face froze. The blood vanished from his cheeks, leaving him looking like a wax figure. His eyes darted around the room, suddenly registering the horrified faces of the board members. He looked at Arthur Pendleton, the chief financial officer, whose face was purple with rage. He looked at Gemma, who was now quietly weeping near the buffet tables. Finally, Connor's panicked eyes found me. I was standing perfectly still in my emerald green gown. I raised my champagne glass an inch in his direction, and I smiled. I don't understand, Connor stammered, his voice cracking into the microphone. You don't understand? Theodore roared, the sudden volume making the front row flinch. The calm facade shattered, revealing the ruthless titan underneath. Let me clarify it for you. We heard everything, Connor. The entire room just listened to your private celebration in the VIP lounge. We heard about your plans to retire me. We heard about the dummy LLC at Apex Financial. We heard about your $1 million skimming operation. Connor stumbled backward, nearly tripping over a monitor cable. No, no, that's a deep fake. Someone is setting me up. You set yourself up, you arrogant fool, Theodore spat. He snapped his fingers, gesturing to the back of the room. Security. 4 large men in dark suits pushed through the double doors, accompanied by 3 uniformed Chicago police officers. Theodore, please, let's talk about this in your office, Connor pleaded, his voice reaching a hysterical pitch. He was sweating profusely now, his expensive tie suddenly looking like a noose. It's Nora. Nora did the math. She's the auditor. Check the IP addresses. She set it up. The cowardice was staggering. Even knowing he was caught red-handed on audio, his instinct was to throw me under the bus, exactly as he had planned. We will be checking everything, Theodore said, stepping away from the podium and letting the officers take the stage, including the wireless lapel microphone you so carelessly spoke into. Officer, remove this man from my sight. Nora! Connor screamed, thrashing against the officers as they wrenched his arms behind his back. Nora, tell them you did the spreadsheets. You're my wife. You have to protect me. The officers dragged him down the stairs. As they hauled him down the center aisle, he passed right by me. He dug his heels into the carpet, desperate for me to intervene. Nora, please, he begged, tears streaming down his face, completely shattered. I stepped forward. The officers paused for a fraction of a second, perhaps expecting a tearful wife to say goodbye. I looked down at the man who had patronized me, belittled me, and plotted to send me to federal prison. I'd love to help you, Connor, I whispered, my voice perfectly clear in the dead silent room. But you specifically told me to just smile, nod, and keep my mouth shut. And I always support my husband. I gave him one final nod. Connor let out a guttural sound of pure despair as the officers dragged him out of the grand ballroom. Gemma was arrested quietly by the coat check 3 minutes later. The fallout was not merely a scandal. It was a scorched earth corporate apocalypse. The next morning, I didn't wake up in the suffocating, sterile perfection of our suburban townhouse. I woke up in a sprawling penthouse suite at the Drake, courtesy of Theodore Brooks. By 9 a.m., I was seated at the head of a massive mahogany table in a high-rise conference room overlooking the icy blue waters of the Chicago River. I was flanked by Meridian Logistics' elite crisis management legal team, Theodore himself, and 2 stern-faced FBI agents from the white-collar crime division. Mrs. Hayes, Special Agent Harrison began, sliding a thick manila file across the polished wood. Your husband has spent the last 8 hours in a holding cell, claiming you were the mastermind behind the Apex Financial shell accounts. He stated unequivocally that your digital signature and IP address are the only ones on all the fraudulent vendor invoices. He claims you acted alone. I took a slow sip of the black coffee a paralegal had poured me. It tasted like freedom. He was half right, I said calmly, pulling my slim silver laptop from my leather tote bag. I slid a connecting cable into the port, mirroring my screen to the massive monitor on the conference room wall. He did use my IP address. He also painstakingly forged my digital signature. What Connor didn't realize is that as a former senior financial auditor, I have a healthy respect for data integrity. The moment he started aggressively demanding I use his laptop to fix his errors, my instincts kicked in. I set up a mirrored backup on our home network router. I clicked a secured file, bringing up a complex, color-coded diagnostic spreadsheet. The lawyers leaned in, their eyes widening. I noticed the discrepancies in the Midwest freight allocations 3 weeks ago, I explained, addressing the room of stunned men in custom suits. He was heavily padding the vendor invoices by 12%. I didn't know about Gemma's involvement or the physical LLC until last night's audio broadcast, but I knew he was embezzling. So, I ran a background script that tracked every single keystroke he made on the home network. Every time he logged in, every time he moved a decimal point, every time he routed funds. I highlighted a massive block of red text on the screen. I have time-stamped logs proving he created the fake accounts, manipulated the routing numbers, and spoofed my credentials. You can cross-reference the timestamps with his cell phone location data. I was at the grocery store or walking the dog during 90% of these transactions. I handed Agent Harrison a secure, encrypted flash drive. It's all in there. Every deleted file, every hidden macro, and every panicked email he sent to his contact at Apex Financial. The silence in the room was absolute, pregnant with awe. Theodore Brooks leaned back in his high-backed leather chair, a slow, deeply appreciative smile spreading across his weathered face. "You didn't just catch him," Theodore murmured, his voice laced with profound respect. "You built a titanium cage around him and handed us the key." "He thought I was simple," I replied, gently closing my laptop. "I just let him believe it until the data was irrefutable." Connor's grand Machiavellian plan crumbled into fine dust by noon. Confronted with the keystroke logs, the devastating audio recording from the gala, and Gemma's immediate plea deal she flipped on him in exchange for a lighter sentence before she even made it out of holding, Connor didn't stand a ghost of a chance. The divorce was spectacularly, brutally brief. My lawyer, a silver-haired shark named Winston, used the impending federal indictments as a bludgeon. During mediation, Connor sat across from me looking like a hollowed-out shell of a man. His expensive Tom Ford suit hung loosely on his frame. He couldn't even meet my eyes. Winston slid the papers across the table. Connor signed over the townhouse, all of his liquid assets, and the entirety of his 401k, just to get me to agree not to pursue a separate civil suit for intentional infliction of emotional distress. He surrendered everything he had ever valued, his money, his status, his pride, just to shave a few months off his inevitable prison sentence. 6 months later, the judge slammed the gavel down, sentencing Connor to 8 years in federal prison for wire fraud, embezzlement, and corporate conspiracy. I didn't attend the sentencing. I didn't need to see him in a jumpsuit to know I had won. I was simply too busy. I was sitting behind a massive oak desk in my new, glass-walled office on the 42nd floor of the Meridian Logistics Tower. Theodore hadn't just paid for my hotel room that night. He had recognized a brilliant, entirely underutilized financial mind that had single-handedly unraveled a $1 million fraud scheme while wearing an evening gown. 2 weeks after the gala, he offered me the newly created position of Director of Internal Audit and Risk Management. I took the job, and I completely dominated it. I restructured their entire internal monitoring framework, closing every loophole and saving the company over $4 million in my first quarter alone. The executives who had once looked right through me at company parties now deferred to me in board meetings. Thomas, the nervous IT guy, was now my loyal deputy. Sometimes, I stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office, holding a cup of hot coffee, watching the snow fall over the sprawling Chicago skyline. I think about the velvet cage I used to live in. I think about the woman who stood in front of the bedroom mirror, trembling with suppressed rage, wondering if her life would ever amount to anything more than ironing shirts and silently absorbing insults. Connor wanted a quiet, obedient wife who would stay in the shadows so he could shine. He got exactly what he asked for. I stayed quiet. I let him do all the talking, and his own voice echoed back to destroy him. Did Connor get exactly what he deserved? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. If you loved this story of ultimate betrayal and sweet revenge, please hit that like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible real-life drama stories. Ring the notification bell so you never miss an update, and I'll see you in the next one. Remember, never underestimate a quiet woman.